Tell us a little bit about your history. How did you become a private, nutritionally based medical practitioner?
Well, the story goes back a long way. I qualified as a doctor in 1981 and was, of course, very conventionally trained. Since that time, I spent 20 years in full-time NHS practice, and the last 12 years have been exclusively private nutritional practice. And what got me interested in nutritional and environmental medicine is because I was asking the question why. It quickly became apparent to me when I started general practice that people wanted to know why they were ill and what changes could they make to their lifestyle, their diet, the way they lived in order to get themselves well. They weren't interested in symptom suppression medication, which is how conventional medicine has gone. As I'm sure you're aware, as we are all, conventional medicine is very much driven by the pharmaceutical companies who are looking for symptom suppression with drugs. So, headache would be treated as a paracetamol deficiency, high cholesterol would be treated as a statin deficiency, or that is what the general perception is. But of course I wanted to know the answer to the question why, and actually this all started at a very personal level because soon after qualifying I had my first baby. I had my daughter Ruth, and she had the most awful colic, and you know, I'd ask all my friends what's causing this colic. Nobody would know. Nobody would know. It's something that traditional medicine just didn't seem to have any, or not traditional medicine, conventional medicine had no answers to. And eventually I worked out through trial and error that it was dairy products. It was dairy products that I was eating that was getting into my breast milk, and Ruth had the most appalling colic as a result of that. And by giving up dairy products, not only did her colic resolve, but my chronic, catarrh and sinusitis resolved, my asthma got better, my energy levels improved, and so on. And that's what triggered my interest in allergy, because I thought, well, if this is what I'm seeing, then lots of other people must be seeing the same thing. So the initial tools I used when I was in general practice were very simple tools, essentially putting people onto Stone Age diets, because they avoid the major allergens. My experience is that the three commonest foods that cause problems are the gluten grains, dairy products, and yeast. And this intervention was extraordinarily effective for all sorts of conditions, so migraine, eczema, asthma, even arthritis. My experience now is that an awful lot of arthritis is simple allergy, and if you can get people eating a good Stone Age diet, then that is an extremely good start. So that, for a while, that helped a very worthwhile section of my patients. And then I would then have another tranche of patients who, yes, the Stone Age diet had been helpful, but they still weren't right, so what next? And I suppose it's a further extension of asking the question, why? Where do we go from here? And the next group of patients that I was introduced to occurred when I moved across to the Welsh borders here, and I started seeing farmers who were complaining of fatigue. And these were otherwise healthy, intelligent guys living the outside life. You'd think that they would be, as well as anybody. Well, to cut a long story short, it became clear that they were suffering from the effects of chronic organophosphate poisoning. Organophosphates are widely used in the farming industry. They were used in the milking parlour to control flies. The farmers used them to dip their sheep to control external parasites. During the 1980s, there were compulsory schemes for treating beef cattle, pouring warblicide along their backs, and these are all organophosphates. And these guys were suffering from the severe effects of organophosphate poisoning, which manifests in lots of ways. Essentially, in the short term, they develop a chronic fatigue syndrome, so they were coming to see me with severe fatigue, so much so that many of them had to give up their farming activities. And the second aspect is what these chemicals do is they seem to accelerate the normal aging process. So these guys were getting diseases before their time. So they were being diagnosed in their 40s with Parkinson's disease, with cancer, with heart disease and dysrhythmias, with autoimmunity. And as I say, this is because the organophosphates attack the body in many different ways. Running in parallel with this, I then found myself seeing more and more patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, chronic fatigue syndrome is just that. It's a clinical picture. It tends to be treated by many doctors as a diagnosis, as if, we've got, it's a diagnosis. But it isn't. It's just a symptom. It's a clinical picture. And we have to ask the question, why? Now, I say, when I first started off in this game, I didn't have many tools. My main tool was Stone Age diet, trial and error with foods. We then had access to some laboratory tests to measure micronutrient levels, and again, that was very helpful. And I found by simple experience that micronutrient deficiencies, by which I mean minerals, deficiency of vitamins, deficiency of essential fatty acids, were so common as to be almost pandemic. And then as the laboratory tests evolved, we then had more tests where we could look at toxic stress to see what people were being poisoned by, whether it was organophosphates in fat, whether it's volatile organic compounds, whether they're being poisoned by heavy metals. And now we have a new tranche of functional tests that show us how those deficiencies and how those toxins impact on us directly. Now, back to chronic fatigue syndrome. Fatigue is just a symptom like pain. We can treat pain in lots of different ways, and because pain has lots of different causes, and fatigue is exactly the same. We have to ask ourselves the mechanism by which people are becoming fatigued. And to address this, a very useful analogy is to think of the body as a car. And the engine of that car are our mitochondria. Now, I'm aware I don't want to baffle people with science, but essentially what mitochondria do is they take fuel from our bloodstream in the form of sugars, in the form of fats, in the form of proteins, and they burn them in the presence of oxygen to produce energy. And the form of energy we use is a molecule called ATP. I think of ATP as money, which can buy any job in the body. So with ATP, you can contract a muscle, you can conduct a nerve, you can make a hormone. But ATP is central, and a good delivery of ATP is essential for our car, for our bodies to run. I'm very good at asking difficult questions, and thankfully I work very closely with a very brilliant biochemist, John McLaren Howard, who runs a laboratory, Acumen. And I said to John, I want a mitochondrial function test. I want a test that tells us how well our car engine works. And John, bless him, has come up with a wonderful test of mitochondrial function. And that tells us how much ATP that patient's mitochondria can produce. We do that test, or rather John does that test in such a way that we can identify not only that the mitochondria are going slow, but why they're going slow. Are they going slow because they're deficient in something? Because they need magnesium, or they need vitamin B3, or they need coenzyme Q10? Or are they going slow because they're blocked by something, in which case he can then do further tests to identify what that blockage is. Now, obviously I can go in with suspicions, so the farmers who've been poisoned by organophosphates, or the Gulf War veterans, or the aerotoxic pilots, we can see organophosphates stuck onto their DNA, or stuck onto their mitochondria, or stuck in their fat or whatever. Or we can do urine samples with provocation tests to see if they're toxic with heavy metals. And I would see mercury poisoning very commonly, lead poisoning, and any one of these things will cause damage to the body. It's a little bit like when people ask me, well, what's the nature of the damage? I say, well, it's like throwing a handful of sand into a finely tuned engine. It just gets in the way of things. It clogs things up. That engine wears out quicker and it runs more slowly. And that's what we see in chronic fatigue syndromes. So with this mitochondrial function test, the joy of this test is it gives us an objective measure of fatigue, which is incredibly helpful for assessing patients, seeing which patients will qualify for benefits, for example, or early pension schemes or whatever. It allows us to identify the biochemical lesion that's going wrong, so we can say why that patient is fatigued and what we have to put in place to correct that. Now, initially, John collected controls, I collected active patients, and we set up a little study. So I asked, between the patients, we agreed how well they were functioning clinically. And then John did the mitochondrial function test, and that was scored by a third party. We then brought all the results together. And what we showed was that those patients who had the worst mitochondrial function score were the most fatigued, and those patients who didn't have too bad mitochondrial function were less fatigued. And there's a beautiful straight line relationship between them. Now, we're going to repeat that study, but in the interim, I've now collected over 30 patients where we've repeated their mitochondrial function tests. And what's so interesting is that as their mitochondrial function improves, so do they improve clinically, and vice versa. So looking at the engine of the car is a really helpful part of recovery. But of course, that's not the only issue. Just like my diesel car won't run on petrol and vice versa, we need to put the right fuel in the tank. And if we don't eat the right food and we don't digest it and absorb it efficiently, then we will never be able to feed our engine with that they need for efficient production. So diet is very important, and gut function is very important. Now, we talked a little bit about diet with respect to the Stone Age diet. The bottom line with the Stone Age diet is that humans have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years eating a diet based on meat, vegetables, nuts, seeds, eggs, fish, and so on. Gluten, grains, dairy products have come into our diet from an evolutionary point of view very recently. And some of us, we just can't handle those things. We're allergic to them, we can't digest them, or they cause other such problems. So the Stone Age diet is the first port of call. Another major way in which our energy delivery is impaired has to do with sugar and refined carbohydrates. And this is a subject I find myself talking about more than all other subjects put together. Because one of the problems with Western diets is they are convenient and addictive. We can have what's called a meal on the table very quickly. We call it fast food, we call it junk food, and it's addictive because when we eat that food, it gives us an immediate psychological hit. This has to do with blood sugar levels rising. When we eat refined carbohydrate, sugar, fruit juice, our blood sugar levels rise very quickly. Now, the brain loves running a high blood sugar because sugar is a staple fuel for the brain. It allows our brain to work quickly and efficiently. It also releases the happy neurotransmitters such as GABA and serotonin, and this gives us that feeling, as I call it, that feeling of satisfaction. And in fact, we have words in the human language which describe that. We call it comfort eating. When I lived over in Nottinghamshire, the comfort food over there was a chip butty, which is chips in white bread, but it might be a chocolate bar, it might be a deep fried Mars bar if you live in Scotland, it might be chocolate or whatever. But people immediately recognise what I'm talking about when I describe the hit that you get from sugar and refined carbohydrates. And interestingly, what addicts respond to is not so much the actual level of sugar in the blood, but the rate at which it comes up. So that's why the refined bit, that's why the sugar bit is important, because we absorb sugars very quickly into the bloodstream, and blood sugar levels come up very quickly. Addicts are the same. Addicts get their hit not so much from the alcohol or the cannabis or the heroin or whatever, but the rate at which their blood levels come up. So a heroin addict doesn't get his hit until he's injecting intravenously. The alcoholic, the drinker, will drink very quickly on an empty stomach in order to get that hit. So it's the rate at which things change that's critical. But if blood sugar levels go up very quickly, that's potentially very damaging to the body. The body responds to that by producing insulin. Insulin is the hormone that brings blood sugar levels down. If blood sugar levels come down very quickly, then the brain starts to panic because it sees its fuel supply running out. And if the brain fuel supply goes very low, we'll go unconscious. Now, that's not permitted. So the brain panics, and the panic hormone is adrenaline, so we pour out adrenaline. What does adrenaline do? It makes us hungry, but it kicks the liver to produce more blood sugar, fine, but it puts our blood pressure up. And as I started to appreciate these issues of refined sugar and carbohydrates and blood sugars going up very quickly and blood sugars coming down very quickly, it rapidly becomes apparent that our modern epidemics of blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, what we call metabolic syndrome, and in the long term then tipping over into heart disease and cancer and Alzheimer's disease, which has been dubbed diabetes of the brain. It suddenly became very obvious to me that the sugar, the refined carbohydrate, our Western addictive eating patterns is what's underpinning our epidemics of modern disease. If you go to primitive communities where the eat Stone Age diet, there is no Alzheimer's disease, there is no heart disease, there is no cancer. Yes, they suffer from infectious diseases, they die from the cold, they die in childbirth, they die in wars and accidents. They have a different different reasons for dying than we do. So pulling this back to chronic fatigue syndrome. Chronic fatigue syndrome, sugar addiction, if your blood sugar levels are fluctuating wildly, it's a little bit like driving a car when one moment the choke is full out and you're flooding the engine with petrol, and the next moment the choke is in and there isn't any petrol there to fuel it. The engine doesn't like that. It's going to wear out quickly. It's going to go slow. So a diet which is of low glycemic index is an important part of recovery from chronic fatigue syndrome because it stabilises the energy delivery. That then brings us on to the second bit, which has to do with gut function. We've talked a little bit about allergy. We want to get rid of the allergy foods. But another major problem that I see in my fatigue syndrome patients are the problems of what I call fermenting gut. Now, let's look at how the human gut should behave. The human gut is quite different from any other mammal gut. The upper gut should be a sterile, digesting, carnivorous gut, like a dog or a cat. The lower gut should be a vegetarian fermenting gut, like a horse or a sheep. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, that's been highly successful. It's meant that we can occupy any ecological niche that the world offers us. So we can survive as obligate carnivores, as Inuit Indians in the north of Canada, just eating fish and blubber and meat. And also we can survive as vegetarians in India, for example. And when it works well, it works really well. But when it goes wrong, it's disastrous. And the main way in which it goes wrong is when the upper gut starts to ferment. Because if the upper gut ferments, we cause problems. Because first of all, the food that we're eating goes to nourish the microbes in our upper gut instead of nourishing us. And lots of my ME fatigue syndrome patients tell me that when they take nutritional supplements, they get worse. And one possible reason for that is that they're feeding their gut microbes and they're not feeding themselves. If you feed gut microbes sugars and carbohydrates that they love to ferment and all these nutritional supplements, then they will ferment those things to produce toxins. Toxins like alcohol, like D-lactate, like hydrogen sulfide, and this is all demonstrable, this has all been proven in trials. So lots of my ME patients tell me they don't tolerate alcohol, but if they're fermenting their food all the time to produce alcohol, that's a chronic, toxic, poisonous challenge to their liver that they have to deal with. Gut fermentation is much better known about in the veterinary world than the human world, and you talk to a vet and they will tell you all about the problems of D-lactate acidosis in cattle. You feed them too much grains, they will ferment, produce D-lactate, and clinically it looks exactly like BSE. In fact, when you do tests on BSE, clinically they may have BSE, but they may not actually have the prion proton when you look at them pathologically. So many cases of D-lactate acidosis, I say, look like BSE, which is a sort of dementia, if you like. Hydrogen sulfide we can ferment, bacteria in the gut will ferment food, produce hydrogen sulfide, which will inhibit mitochondria directly. And that will cause fatigue in its own right. A third problem with upper fermenting gut is you can become allergic to those microbes in the gut. And a major problem I see in my ME patients is a yeast or a Candida problem, as it's called, which arises partly because they're fermenting, but partly because they can actually sensitize and get allergic to yeast and bacteria in the gut. Now, this is like an asthmatic walking around with a dog under his nose. There's chronic antigenic allergic insult there that they're never free from. And so tackling that with low carbohydrate diets, being careful with the nutritional supplements and how you apply them, taking specific antifungals, which can be natural, they can be herbal things, and there are lots of wonderful plant extracts, turmeric, garlic, Paldaco tea, oregano complex, olive leaf extract. All these things have antifungal activity and help to suppress the upper fermenting gut. Sometimes you have to use prescription drugs. I prefer not to for obvious reasons. I like to cure things in as simple a way as possible, but sometimes that's necessary. So correcting the upper fermenting gut is a major part of treatment. Coming back to the treatment of chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, the most useful analogy is the car analogy. We've talked about the engine of the car, we've talked about the fuel that goes in the tank with respect to diet and gut function. A next very important aspect has to do with the accelerator pedal. The accelerator pedal in the human body is the thyroid gland. That controls how fast our metabolism goes. Now, we are seeing an epidemic of thyroid dysfunction. There are lots of possible reasons why that may be the case. As a nation, we are deficient in iodine, and iodine is necessary to make thyroid hormones. We are also being attacked by lots of other halides, in particular fluoride and bromide, which will compete with iodine for access to the thyroid gland. In fact, it's not just the thyroid gland that needs iodine. The breast, the bone marrow, the brain are equally demanding of iodine. But iodine deficiency, as I say, is extremely common. With underactive thyroid, there are three common problems. First is primary hypothyroidism, when the thyroid gland itself goes to sleep and doesn't produce the necessary thyroid hormones. That may be because of iodine deficiency, that may be because of autoimmunity. In my chronic fatigue ME patients, I often see secondary hypothyroidism, where the pituitary seems to have gone to sleep and the thyroid gland simply isn't getting the drive from the pituitary gland for it to function normally. There is a third, less common cause where there's poor conversion of relatively inactive T4 into the active hormone T3. What this means is that to properly assess a patient biochemically, I need to see levels of free T4, free T3 and TSH, and I need to assess that patient clinically. Do they have a symptom list that adds up to a possible diagnosis of underactive thyroid? And of course, anybody with chronic fatigue syndrome could be underactive with their thyroid. Some patients have tests which are within the laboratory's reference range, but that doesn't mean to say it's their personal normal range, because we all have a personal normal range which is individual to ourselves and within that range. Correcting thyroid function, therefore, is a very important part of managing chronic fatigue syndrome. We then have adrenal function. And again, using the car analogy, the adrenal gland is like the gearbox of our car. It allows us to move up a gear when we're stressed. And of course, normal life is full of stresses. The body wants to work as efficiently as it can in order that it can optimize the energy that's available to it. And sitting in front of the television, relaxing in the evening, we're all going around in first and second gear. But to function, to work, to compete, to do physical activity, we will move up into third or fourth or fifth gear. And that's totally desirable, an essential part of normal life. But what I see so often in my chronic fatigue syndrome ME patients is chronic, unremitting stress. They don't have a break, they don't sleep well at night. Maybe they're stressed by unnecessary or necessary anxieties. Maybe they're stressed by chronic low blood sugar and hypoglycemia, so Western diets are inherently stressful for that reason. And maybe they're stressed mentally by life stresses. Maybe they're stressed immunologically because of chronic allergies or because of chronic infection. And indeed, infection and indeed vaccination are very powerful triggers for chronic fatigue syndrome and ME. And it's the adrenal gland allows us to cope with those stresses in the short term. But let's say if that stress is unremitting, chronic, long-term, eventually that patient will break down into a chronic fatigue syndrome. And these aren't my ideas. These are the ideas of Hans Seeley, who developed these during the 1930s in his seminal work and wrote a wonderful book called The Stress of Life, which encompasses all that. But we can measure adrenal function very simply with salivary tests, tells us a little bit about how well the adrenal gland works and which hormones we need to give low-dose physiological support to, and again, that can be a very helpful part of treatment. As part of talking about the stress, I alluded to sleep. And of course, it's a give, it's a sine qua non that poor sleep will result in chronic fatigue. Again, using the car analogy, our sleep is when we service and repair our cars. That's when the healing takes place. One cannot do physical work or mental work or immunological work without a certain amount of damage to cells. So we damage our bodies a little bit by day. In fact, the business of exercising, in order to get fitter, we have to damage our muscles a little bit. But it's during sleep that the healing and repair process takes place. And without adequate sleep on a regular basis, the body will gradually break down. And in fact, we now know that chronic insomnia is a major risk factor for chronic degenerative diseases, cancer, heart disease, and so on. So getting a good night's sleep on a regular basis is very important, and I talk about that at length when I see patients. And now there's another facet of fatigue syndromes that I find myself addressing increasingly, which is the business of detoxing. Now, just like a car engine will produce exhaust fumes. Car engines never burn with perfect efficiency. And so it is with our mitochondria and energy delivery methods. Mitochondria don't work with perfect efficiency. They produce exhaust gases too, and we call them free radicals. Free radicals are highly damaging molecules. For the chemists listening, a free radical is a molecule with an unpaired electron. Its life is measured in billionths of a second. But the point about those unstable molecules is they will stick onto something and damage it. They'll stick onto cell membranes, they'll stick onto DNA, they'll stick onto proteins, and they will distort them. And that is part of the aging process. But if we have a good antioxidant system, and I liken that to the catalytic converter of our car, that allows us to mop up those free radicals and minimise the damage from them. And when we do tests, I routinely measure the frontline antioxidants like superoxide dismutase, coenzyme Q10, glutathione peroxidase. There are other antioxidants as well, like vitamin E, vitamin D, vitamin C. And without adequate amounts of all those nutrients, we can't handle and get rid of and deal with our free radicals efficiently. So checking the antioxidant system is very important. That helps to minimise the toxic stress. But modern life, unfortunately, we live in a modern world which is becoming increasingly polluted. The obvious examples are pesticides, which we spray on our foods, which inevitably come through into the food chain. But another example of increasing pollution has to do with heavy metals. Ever since human beings started to mine the Earth's crust for oil, for coal, for gas, we have been mobilising heavy metals into the air, into the water and into our food. So whether we like it or not, we are all exposed to heavy metals. That then, of course, is made much worse by man's activity, dental amalgam fillings, cadmium in cigarette smoking, lead pipes, nickel, which is used in jewellery and piercings. We are, as I say, inevitably exposed to heavy metals. So heavy metals can be poisonous, and indeed probably the most obvious clinical manifestation of this is that we are currently seeing an epidemic of cardiac dysrhythmias, particularly atrial fibrillation, ventricular ectopics, and so on. Now, we have known for some years that chelation therapy is a very good treatment for those conditions. Chelation therapy works because it grabs hold of heavy metals and pulls them out. And again, we can test this very simply. We can measure toxic metals in urine, following such a chelating agent, identify which heavy metals that person is being poisoned with, and that helps them to detox. The body itself has very good mechanisms for detoxing. The liver, which is an extremely large organ, top right hand side of the abdomen there, specialises in detoxing as part of its job. And we have a series of enzyme systems there called our P450 cytochrome system, which uses amino acids, sulfates, glutathione, sugars, in order to help pull out toxins from the body. Some of those toxins arise from the fermenting gut and from food itself. So food is inherently toxic, and we detoxify that in the liver. We produce hormones and neurotransmitters, which have to be broken down in the liver. But because we now have this increasing exogenous loads of chemicals, which are coming in through our diet, through the water, through our skin, the liver is being increasingly loaded up with toxins. And so to give the liver a bit of help is going to be a good thing. Now, we can help the liver in lots of ways. We can feed it the things that it needs. So the liver will be very demanding of minerals. It will be very demanding of vitamins and some amino acids. The one I like best of all is glutathione, which is a 3 amino acid polypeptide, which is essential for normal detoxification. And so, for example, we can do an awful lot with good levels of minerals and glutathione for stripping out all the metals. That will be effective in pulling out nickel, mercury, lead to a certain extent. We can also help the liver by allowing the body to detoxify in other ways. And of course, a very good way of detoxing is through the skin. And the skin is very porous. Toxins will come out through the skin very easily. And of course, the nicest way to detox is to go for take exercise, go for a good walk, get too hot, because the heating, and the heat is far infrared heat that's generated by our muscles, that heat will mobilize and literally boil off those toxins onto the lipid layer on the surface of our skin. And then when we come back and have a shower, we wash those toxins off and we detoxify that way. Of course, my poor, fatigued ME patients can't exercise. And so what I ask those patients to do is to sauna. Now, heat, again, my poor ME patients, they don't have the energy to tolerate hot saunas or hot baths. And so I tend to use far infrared sauning, which is superficial. Far infrared is the heat from the sun effectively, so sunbathing would do just as good a job, but it shakes up the molecules in the subcutaneous flesh just under the skin, mobilizes them onto the fatty layer on the surface of the skin, and then they wash off. And I've now done all fat biopsies on about 30 or 40 patients now, or other tests of toxic status. And what I find is that the toxic load is reduced reliably well using far infrared sauning. So that has now become an important tool of the trade. And roughly speaking, and this is very rough, but about 50 saunas will halve the total load. So toxins come out of the body exponentially. So you'll get to half the load in 50 saunas, and then a quarter of the load in 100 saunas, and so on. Now, I have to say, I'm increasingly coming to the view that because we live in such a toxic world, we should all be doing something to help us detox. We should keep the load down by eating a Stone Age diet. We should be taking micronutrient supplements to support the liver, and we should all be exercising regularly and getting hot and showering or bathing afterwards in order to keep the toxic load down. Now, that is a thumbnail of how I treat my chronic fatigue syndrome patients. But that approach to medicine is actually a blueprint for good health for life. And actually, we should probably be doing all those things in order that we can all live up to our full potential on an everyday basis, because we all need energy to realise our full potential every day, and also to live to our full biological potential. Actually, we have the potential to live to 120 years. Most of us don't get there because we mess things up on the way, because We don't eat the perfect diet. We poison ourselves with sugar, cigarettes, heavy metals, or whatever. And now, I'm no paragon of virtue. I certainly don't expect to live to 120, but I want to live, as well as I can to my full potential. So the point here is that whoever comes to me, for whatever health reason, and sometimes that reason is they just want to maintain the health they've got. One guy who came to see me, his idea of ill health was that he ran his marathons in 3 hours, 20 minutes, and he wanted to get his time down. And sure enough, he put all this in place, and he went away and he won the Potter's Marathon. So this is the starting point for treating absolutely anything. The basic foundation stones of Stone Age diet, good package of micronutrient supplements, sleep, exercise and pacing is where we start from. We've looked at what we need to put in place as a basic blueprint for health. The Stone Age diet is vital, good package of micronutrients, the right balance between work, exercise and rest, and sleep, and of course detoxing. So anybody who comes to me for whatever reason, we will spend time on that basic package. It's like building a house. We get the foundation stones in place first, and then we have what I call the bolt-on extras. Now, people often come to me because they have a bolt-on extra problem, because they have migraine, because they have arthritis, because they have cancer or whatever. A very common problem is what's called metabolic syndrome. People can't lose weight, they have high blood pressure, their energy isn't as good as it should be, their brain doesn't work as efficiently as perhaps it should be. They feel they are just aging faster than they should. And for those people, that basic package will take them a very long way. If they have heart problems in addition to this, then there are what I call the bolt-on extras for arterial disease and for heart conditions generally. So, for example, people often ask me about cholesterol problems. There is a myth that a high-fat diet will result in high cholesterol levels, which will cause arterial damage. There isn't a scrap of evidence that demonstrates any one of those links. In fact, I could show you papers that demonstrated that the higher the cholesterol you have, the better your longevity. Because cholesterol is essential for normal brain function, is essential for normal immune function. And without good brain function and without immune function, we would rapidly decline. With cholesterol, the important bit is what is the proportion of the friendly cholesterol, the HDL cholesterol. And to have good cholesterol levels, we need good levels of vitamin D. Vitamin D is one of my pet subjects. Vitamin D is highly protective against a whole range of degenerative conditions, against cancer, autoimmunity, including allergies, multiple sclerosis, arthritis. So vitamin D and cholesterol, there's a very close association between the two because cholesterol is the raw material from which vitamin D is made in the skin. So to make vitamin D, you need cholesterol in the skin, sunshine lands on that cholesterol and it turns into vitamin D. So vitamin D deficiency alone will cause high cholesterol because the body's way of addressing vitamin D deficiency is to push out more cholesterol, so when the sunshine comes along it's in a fit and ready position to start making vitamin D. So there's a close association there. But within cholesterol we have good cholesterols and we have bad cholesterols, and the friendly cholesterol, the good cholesterol, is HDL. And HDL is responsible for healing and repairing blood vessels. And to have good levels of HDL, we need good antioxidant status. So it's back to nutrition, it's back to all the minerals and the vitamins that we need in order to make antioxidants. High cholesterol is not statin deficiency. Statins are extremely damaging because statins, okay, they bring the cholesterol down, but it's a biochemical result, it's not a clinical result. One of the problems with statins is they interfere with the body's own production of coenzyme Q10. Coenzyme Q10 is one of the most important molecules as an antioxidant and also as part of mitochondrial function. In fact, I think of coenzyme Q10 as the oil of our engine. It's the most important electron donor and receptor within mitochondria. It allows the wheels of mitochondria to flow and therefore assure a good energy delivery system. And what statins will do in the heart is they will impair energy delivery in the heart. What happens when you do that? You get impaired energy delivery and the muscle doesn't contract strongly. If the muscle doesn't contract strongly, you develop heart failure. So we may see some evidence of statins helping arterial disease, but we're now seeing an epidemic of heart failure, and that is statin induced. Another way in which statins are a problem is they interfere with cholesterol metabolism in the brain. The brain is 60% fat. A large proportion of that is cholesterol, and we are seeing epidemics of dementia, and I think that is partly statin driven. You know, we have turned into a nation of fat phobics. It's a nonsense, but we're using all these statins. Fat phobia, that is driven by poor education, driven by the pharmaceutical companies. Statins biochemically look like vitamin D. So statins are an expensive way of giving us a dose of vitamin D with lots of nasty side effects. So my view is, let's give everybody vitamin D. Let's face it, we evolved running naked under the African sunshine, getting vitamin D 12 hours a day, 365 days a year, and here we are, you know, in dark climates, you know, not getting any sunshine on our skin for months at an end. So we all have vitamin D deficiency. So much so that laboratory normal ranges have changed. The actual normal range of vitamin D is 75 to 200, and that is ideal. Some NHS lab ranges, their normal range is 30 to 60. So it doesn't even approach what the real normal range is. And that's because they take their normal ranges by looking at the so-called normal population. But the normal population isn't normal because we're all sunshine deficient. So vitamin D is a major issue. Vitamin D is highly protective against heart disease. It's highly protective against cancer. It's highly protective against viral illnesses like flu. Your risks of getting flu are enormously mitigated and protected by having high levels of vitamin D. And to get those levels, you've got to have levels well above 100, which is impossible to get in this country with sunshine. There just isn't enough sunshine. So sunshine is very important because of vitamin D. Another major problem that I see as a cause of arterial disease is homocysteine. Homocysteine is symptomatic, again using a car analogy, homocysteine is symptomatic of poor methylation. And methylation is like the toolbox of our car. So for example, if the body's going to read DNA in order to make new proteins, we need to be able to switch DNA on and switch it off using methylation, and that's called transcription. So to be able to read the genetic code, we have to be able to methylate. If you've got high homocysteine, you don't methylate properly. You can't heal and repair, you can't read your DNA, the brain doesn't work properly, the immune system can't work properly, and so on. And if you can't heal and repair, you can't heal those damaged blood vessels. So high homocysteine is a major risk factor for arterial disease. It's probably a genetic weakness that results in high homocysteine levels, but it can be treated with 3 vitamins, vitamin B12, vitamin B6 and folic acid. So I give my patients high doses of those 3 vitamins, their homocysteine comes down, and guess what? They feel much better for that as well. And that brings me on to another one of my favourite vitamins, which is vitamin B12. It's been known for decades that vitamin B12 is a good treatment for fatigue. It's safe, it has no known toxicity, patients see immediate benefit from having B12, and many of our patients absolutely love B12. It's a good treatment for low mood, for asthma, for dementia and foggy brain. In fact, it's a good treatment for physical fatigue. In fact, it's difficult to think of a condition that wouldn't benefit from B12. And I teach many of my patients to inject themselves with B12, and they do that on a regular basis. In fact, I learned recently that when the top chess players are competing, they inject themselves with B12 on a daily basis because their brain works so much better. And lots of my patients will testify to that. Potential for harm, 0. So B12 is an important part of my armamentarium because it often gives patients the energy they need in order to put in place the difficult lifestyle changes that I'm asking them to do with respect to their diet and supplements and everything else. So often B12 is a very important part of just making that person, allowing to function at their full potential. Another area where I'm often consulted has to do with allergies. We are seeing epidemics of allergies at the moment. Allergy I see as the immune system getting its wires crossed. It's reacting against things inappropriately. So the commonest allergens are to grains, to gluten grains, to dairy products and to yeast. And the immune system for some reason is reacting against the strong proteins in those foods. Now that can cause problems for lots of reasons. First of all, we have a certain pot of energy that's available to us in a day, and we can spend that energy mentally, physically, emotionally or immunologically, and at the end of the day we're tired and we have a good evening meal and we have a good night's sleep, and that pot of energy is restored. The trouble with allergy is it punches a hole in that pot of energy. So because the immune system, like the brain, is enormously demanding of energy. So if we're reacting allergically to a food, it's like we're leaking out energy from our pot. Now, if you've got a large pot of energy, it's not a problem. You don't notice that too much. But if your energy pot is impaired because you're older, because the mitochondria don't work so well, because you've got poor thyroid function, then that will become clinically significant. And allergy is a major cause of fatigue. But it can also cause local symptoms wherever you're reacting allergically. So irritable bowel syndrome, for example, which is not a diagnosis, it's a symptom. Irritable bowel syndrome is often caused by allergy to foods because there's inflammation in the gut. And that causes pain, indigestion, wind, gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, or whatever. Avoiding the specific foods, very helpful. You can get allergic reactions in the lungs. Asthma, you can get allergic reactions in the brain. Migraine. One condition that I'm increasingly recognising is what I call allergic muscles. Muscles can react allergically just like any other part of the body can react allergically. Muscles can only do one thing, which is go into spasm. And the characteristic of allergic muscles is very severe pain that comes on very suddenly and passes very quickly. And so if you look at a patient with allergic muscles, you might think, well, they're a complete hypochondriac because, one moment they're absolutely fine and the next moment they're absolutely not. In fact, muscle spasm is one of the nastiest pains that one can experience. So you ask any woman who's been in labour, that's often the worst pain she's had. That's muscle spasm of the womb. Biliary colic is muscle spasm. Renal colic is muscle spasm. So if one gets that symptom of very painful muscles, then one thinks allergy. So allergy is the great mimic. It can produce almost any symptom. One diagnoses allergy first by detective work, looking at the clinical picture. Sometimes tests can be helpful, but I don't use them terribly often. And the most important way to treat allergy would be avoidance. But if you have somebody who has multiple allergies, then desensitization may well be necessary. And that's another tool that I can offer patients, or that we environmental doctors can offer patients to reduce their allergic load. So to conclude, if you were to ask me my overview of how my medicine works, I would say the single most important thing to do is always ask the question why. What is it that is causing this person's symptom? And the second most important principle is to mimic nature. Humans evolved in over hundreds of thousands of years in a system with a Stone Age diet, running naked under the African sunshine, getting 12 hours sleep during the dark and 12 hours awakening, with eating a diet that was perfectly balanced in micronutrients and free from toxic stress. That's the fundamental principle that we should try to emulate in treating almost anything. Having got that in place, or those principles in place, as best as is possible, because I can assure you nobody can completely copy that state of affairs, we then have the bolt-on extra problems. because we live in a toxic world, we have to work hard at the detoxification regimes, whether that's avoidance, sweating regimes, chelation regimes, high-fat diets. High-fat will again help us to detoxify, improving gut function, ditto. We have to maybe look very hard at the stresses on our life, because stress is a drain on our resources. It's a drain on our energy resources. It's a drain on our nutritional resources. And young people have, boundless energy, but as we get older, we have to get more efficient at managing our lives and getting the right balance between delightful stress, which gives us energy, if you like, work stress, which takes energy from us, and then, of course, rest when the body can recuperate fully. And getting that balance right is always difficult, but it's an essential part of being well. And one of the analogies I like to draw with my patients is a little bit like walking along the white cliffs of Dover. You don't want to live life too close to the edge, because if you make a mistake, you're down on the bottom of the beach, and it's a long climb to get back up onto the top. We want to live our life a little bit away from the edge. So if we do make a mistake, or we get a viral infection or whatever, we fall over on the green turf, and it's quite easy to get back on and carry on our journey. So always make sure you've got a little bit of reserve in hand, so you're not, say, living your life on the edge all the time. Otherwise, a little crisis, and life is full of little crises, will tip you over the edge into ill health. So the management strategy is all important.